Hello everyone, we are on lesson 6 today and we are going to continue moving forward as we work on different techniques to create the illusion of depth and three-dimensionality into our pencil sketches. We have just finished up looking at shading. We now know how to shade solid shading, we know how to do gradual shading, and we also know how we can use shading to create the illusion of texture as well. So hopefully you've been practicing that and you're ready to move forward. The next concept we're going to talk a little bit about is the idea of shade versus shadow. So sometimes when I'm talking to students, we interchange it. We think maybe it means the same thing. And actually, they have two different meanings. They do both have to do with a light source and the dark part of a light source. However, if you remember, we know that shading is the part that is on the object. So it's on the object. And when the light source is shining down, if mine's at the top right, then we know that the sides that are opposite that light source, the ones that aren't in direct path of that ray, they're going to be darkest. And so that's where we shade and use our shading techniques to create that. We know that areas that have a little bit of the ray but not its full exposure are going to be slightly shaded. And that creates our illusion of depth and volume to this cube. So when we're using shading, this is how we do it. However, often we're going to use shadow as well. Shadow is the part, the dark part that is cast or thrown off of an object. And so what it's doing is the area that when the light comes shining down, this object is blocking its path. And so what happens is the shadow is cast. And so if we do the shadow on this one, it gets cast off of our object, right? So shading on the object, shadow is off of the object. The best way to use these, of course, are together, because once we start using shading and throwing off shadows as well, we are creating a double hit of an illusion of three-dimensionality. So that's really what we want to be doing. So what I want us to do is just kind of practice this technique a little bit. And if you've ever played around in the shadows, most of us do, you sometimes are making like shadow animals, or sometimes you can stand, and depending on what time of day it is, your shadow could be really long or it could be really short. If it's really long, you can make some really goofy kind of shapes and stuff. And so I just want to play around with that concept. So when we're talking about shadows, of course, just like shading, we need a light source. So I'm just going to draw this in. We'll use the sun. If this is our light source and this is our object, maybe just for variation, I'll do a cylinder. So if this is my object here, if the light source is directly over top of it, so this is kind of like if you think about the sun during the day, this would be at noon. So when the sun's the highest, and often if you look, that's when we have the least amount of shadow, because the sun is directly, or the light source is directly on us, and so we will only have a little bit of shadow. As the sun, in the morning before it gets here, as it's rising, what we want to do is we want to think about where would that be hitting and how far away, how much distance is there from this object to the light source. And so the lower down the light source, the longer your shadow that's going to be cast. So this is really low down. It's shining onto our object, and so we know that our shadow that's going to be cast is going to be quite long. See that? And a shadow doesn't necessarily take the exact shape. And I always follow. So if this was the darkest side, if this was where my shading was going to be, then I know that my shadow is also going to be off of that side as well. Okay? as the sun rises or as my light sources change angles, the amount that's being blocked is slightly less, and so my shadow is slightly less. Do you see that? So the difference between where it's down here closer to the ground and this one where it's at a higher angle, as opposed to this one where it's right at the top. Okay, and the same thing happens when we go around. So if the light source was now here, then we know that our shadow would be cast in this direction. Our shading would be on this side, and our shadow wouldn't be terribly long. And then if it got lower, again, it's coming across the opposite side. It's going to have a longer shadow. So depending on the angle will depend on the shadow. So shadow length depends on the angle of the light source. So maybe when you're at home tomorrow or later today, just do a little test. Maybe you can find an object, stick it by a window, and just notice what's happening to the shadow as the day progresses. Notice if the shadow changes the direction, if it changes length, that sort of thing. And that will help you just get a little bit more observant and be able to work with your shadows a little bit better when you are creating your own sketches and wanting to implement them into your work. So that is just a little heads up on shadows and how you can use them. The last thing I want to talk about when we're discussing shadows is just notice when I've been putting my shadows, they have been following the horizon line. Okay, so the horizon line is the line that's in the background, whether it's sitting on a table or whether it's sitting outside and there's hills in the background. The horizon line is that line that when you look out into the distance, you can kind of see where the land and the sky meet, or the table and the wall, meet up, that sort of a thing. So that's known as a horizon line. Your shadows are going to follow the direction of your horizon line. They could come out a little bit like this from your object, for sure. But a lot of people, when they first start using shadows, and I'll just demonstrate by doing a cube. A lot of the time when people are starting to use shadow, if they've got their light source, and we know that this is our darkest shaded side, and then we have a little bit of shading on this side. What a lot of people will do is say, oh, okay, it's coming down here, so my shadow is going to come like this. Perfect, there's my shadow. Well, if you notice, that actually looks a little bit weird. It's taking away from the three-dimensional feel of it. It feels almost like it's flattening it out. Your brain is having a hard time connecting that this is actually ground, because ground we know is flat and goes horizontally, and this is just kind of going in a wonky way. So rather than having your shadow going down like this or even straight down, I've seen all different types. What you really want to do is always think about that horizon line. And so when you are putting in your shadow, I'll just do another example to show you the right way. And then it's nice too, because it gives you a visual of the right and wrong, and you really notice there is a huge difference between the two. And this is a little bit lighter. I'm a little sloppy today. There we go. So if this is my light source, it's casting down. Rather than doing this, which is not the correct way, it flattens things out. We want to think about our horizon line, right? If this is the back line, whether it's sitting on a table or on the ground, then we know this is going horizontally, right? We want our shadow to also do that. We want it to follow, be parallel to that. Yeah. Do you see the difference? There's a big difference. This, your brain connects and says, oh, okay, yeah, this looks like it's the shadow, it's being cast onto flat land, as opposed to this one, which looks like it's maybe breaking through or it's really hard to understand what is happening here. So always make sure that your shadows are parallel to your horizon line. That's going to make a big difference. You also want to make sure when you're doing your shadows that it makes sense to the shape of your object. So for example, if I was going to build something on top of this, maybe I'm going to stack a box and then I'm going to connect them using a tube. Looks like one of those little hamster kind of houses that they crawl up in. So if this was my shape, if I just started doing my horizon, or sorry, my shadow like this, that looks a little bit strange because all I'm taking into consideration is the shadow that's being cast off of the first cube. But I know that there's a second cube on top, and I also know that there's this cylinder that's connecting them. So I can put in my shading. So this is my gradual shading, this is my solid shading. And then when I'm going and I'm putting in my shadows, I want to think about one, of course, what angle is my light source coming from? And then once I've determined the light or the angle that it is, I then can go in and start putting in a bit of a shape that mimics this one. So it feels like, oh, that really is the shadow of this actual object. So you want to be thinking about that when you're putting your shadows in too. So those are two things that I would encourage you just to kind of think about and incorporate when you're using shadows. And this is really just to kind of teach you the difference between shading and a shadow so that you're able to use them in your own drawings. So what I would encourage you right now to go and do is to practice doing some shadows and incorporating them with your shaded objects. Try doing some experiments about different angles and see what direction those and lengths those shadows are going to be cast in. And then if you're feeling inspired, maybe take an object or two at home, maybe, something simple. It could just be a little box that you have. It could be an orange from the fruit basket. It could be a ball, something simple. It could be a can of soup from the pantry, whatever. And maybe practice drawing that in different lighting circumstances. If you have a light that you can move, that's awesome. That's ideal. If not, then maybe put it in a spot, and maybe your goal will be to draw it 3 or 4 times in one day, and just note the different times of day that you draw it. So maybe you're going to aim to do, a can of soup at 9 a.m. You're going to do one at 12. You're going to do one at 3, and you're going to do one at, 7. And then what you can do is you can do a little experiment and see what these look like at the different times of day and where their shadows are and where their shading would be. So that would be a fun little experiment that you could do to play around with this and just develop your skills in this area so that you feel really confident incorporating them into your sketches and your own creations. So I hope that's helped clear up a little bit of what is often confused between shading and shadows. And I am looking forward to working on another new technique that you can incorporate into your drawings next time we meet. Have a great day and get out there and do some art.